All right, hello everybody. Welcome to this lunchtime lecture, A Man on Fire, The Worlds of Thomas Wentworth Higginson. My name is Walker Goodmote. I'm the Interpretation and Communications Coordinator over at the Seward House Museum. Before I introduce Dr. Egerton, I just want to hit you with a couple upcoming events at the Seward House Museum. May 15th, we'll be hosting historian David Brown, who will be discussing his new book, Hell of a Storm, which is an in-depth discussion of the 1854 Kansas-Nebraska Act, which kicked off a mini civil war and started more radical thoughts of disunion, so we're very excited about that. Tickets will be available soon. May 16th, something I think a lot of you might have been waiting for, the ribbon cutting for our barn and carriage project. So the barn and carriage house behind the museum will be open to the public for the first time since their renovation. They'll have a ceremony. That'll be May 16th. Lastly, our next lunchtime lecture right here in the Equal Rights Heritage Center will be called Stone by Stone. Our Director of Operations, Mitch Manicha, will be talking about the barn and carriage restoration project and discussing that. So that's May 21st. We're excited for that as well. It's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Douglas Egerton. Dr. Egerton is Professor of History at Moyne College, my alma mater. He's the author of numerous books, including Heirs of an Honor Name, The Decline of the Addams Family and the Rise of Modern America, and Thunder at the Gates, the Black Civil War Regiments that Redeemed America. He's also a former Seward House Museum board member and my former professor and mentor. I'm very grateful for all his support. So would you please welcome Dr. Egerton.
Put this here. Well, thank you all for coming out on such a lovely day when we should all just be sitting outside and enjoying the sun finally. Great to be back at the Seward House. As Walker said, I was on the board. And I think I rotated off about 2 years ago, so I've not been back, and all the material in the back just looks fantastic, so I'm looking forward to seeing that. Quick opening comment. One of the virtues of getting older is you have time to write books like this. One of the downsides is cataract and emergency retina surgery. So this side of the room is really clear. This side of the room is kind of strobing. So if I kind of miss a word here because of my notes, which I've made really big, like 16-point font so I can see them, take that into account. Talk about 30 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions and discussion. I've got about 10 or 11 images here to show you. Let me start with kind of the obvious question I've been getting, and I have been doing a number of book talks about this book and about Higginson. And one is, why this book, why now, and why am I the person to write it? I find that one book leads to the next. That's probably true for most historians. And so Higginson has had cameos in 3 of my books. Walker mentioned my 1860 book. And Higginson was a very reluctant Lincoln voter because Higginson, of course, was a militant abolitionist, and Lincoln was not, certainly. He was a free soiler at that point. In my book on the black regiments down on the Carolina coast, Higginson was already there. He was down there with this contraband regiment. I'll be talking about the 1st South Carolina Regiment, which is the first black regiment to be approved by the War Department. And then my last book on the 3rd and 4th generation of Adamses. That was Charles Francis Sr. and his children, Henry Charles Jr. He was all over that book because, of course, Higginson was down in the Free Soil trenches in Massachusetts with Adams in the 1840s and 1850s, and then knew also Charles Francis Jr., the son, during the war, because Charles Francis Jr. also was a colonel of a black regiment, and in his case, Adams led the 1st South Carolina, the 1st Massachusetts Cavalry, which is an all-black regiment. And Higginson always liked the Adamses. I'll get to this. He was not crazy about Seward. I'll explain that one. Luckily, he was not seeing Adams's correspondence because John Quincy, Charles Francis Adams Jr., and his correspondence used the N-word like he has Tourette's, and never bothered to learn about the black men in his regiment, one of whom was the son of Frederick Douglass. Charles Douglass was in Adams's regiment. So why this book now? Well, I've been thinking about this for a long time. And every time I'm thinking about the next project, my wife, my colleague, historian Lee Fott, says, what about Higginson? And I kept kind of putting it off. In part, a lot of publishers just weren't that fascinated by Higginson. They're like, well, he's not really like Lincoln, is he? He's not that famous. And my response is, well, do we need another book on Lincoln? We've had one every 6 months since God knows when. And Lee convinced me that I was the person to write this book. I almost called it The Ally, because if there was a good cause, Higginson was all in. He's an anti-slavery guy, he's a women's rights guy, he's a temperance advocate, he's on public school boards, he's involved in kind of every possible affair. And so, let me put it this way. I don't think one has to be French to write a biography of Napoleon Bonaparte. It might help, it doesn't have to be. Higginson was a privileged white guy, came from old money, a sixth-generation Harvard guy. And I've led a pretty privileged life as, raised in a nice middle-class white family in Arizona and went to Georgetown, hired by Moyne. And he was a man who loved women, and he had two wonderful granddaughters, one of whom tragically died very young. And so I dedicated the book to the women in my life, and to my wonderful wife, and to my two amazing daughters, and my two spectacularly brilliant granddaughters. And so I confess I kind of connect with Higginson in a way I didn't always connect with people I was writing about. So a quick bio of this man, born in 1823 in Cambridge, Massachusetts. His family had been here for 2 centuries. The first Higginson to get here got to Plymouth in the 1620s, even before Boston was founded in 1630, and had gone to Harvard. His father had gone to Harvard, his grandfather had gone to Harvard, and so he's born in this house, which is still, by the way, standing. And he's such a New England guy. He actually dies in a house in Cambridge about 2 streets away. So he's just always he thinks of himself very much as kind of a New England guy, the Massachusetts kind of guy. And here's his mother, Louisa. And Louisa, I think, is kind of his secret of his success in many ways. Louisa is the wife, number 2, of a much older husband. In fact, she'd been hired by the husband to take care of the first wife, who was always unwell, primarily because she just had endless pregnancies. So his father died when he was 9 and kind of had no impact on him. He wrote 2 autobiographies, Higginson did, and talked a lot about his grandfather, but almost never mentioned his father, who just kind of didn't seem to be on the radar screen. And so then he marries the much younger Louisa. And Louisa has 9 children. And this being, the 19th century, half of them die, and they die young, and the ones who die are the ones slightly older than Higginson. So he basically is raised as an only child, and he has an Aunt Nancy who never married, and Aunt Nancy lives with them. So he's essentially raised as a single child by these 2 very powerful, dynamic, brilliant women. And his mother, Louisa, also kept a diary. And most of the materials for Higginson and his family are at Harvard. He just gave them to Harvard late in life. Those of us who have children, and again, I've got now children and grandchildren, we're convinced they are perfect and brilliant and gorgeous. But she was just convinced that little Tommy, as she called him, it was just the most brilliant child on the planet. And so I think part of why he was so invested in women's rights was because he had this very strong-minded mother. But also because he was raised with just enormous self-confidence. He just believed he could do anything, and I think that's kind of the result of his mother. No matter where he was, he's out in Kansas running guns with John Brown. He wrote her virtually every day of his life until she died toward the end of the Civil War in 1864. Okay. So I do this. Okay. Here he is at the age of 23. He just graduated from Harvard. In those days, there's an entrance test mostly based upon Latin and Greek. And so it's not like today where you turn 18, you finished high school, you go to college. So he'd gone to a special college, pardon me, a special school to learn all these Greek, Latin, that kind of thing. So he aced all of his exams and starts Harvard when he's 13 years old. He's the youngest person in the class. And so if his mom thought he was brilliant, probably there's a reason for that. So here he is, he'd graduated, and he'd gone back to Harvard for divinity school. So he's 23, and at this point has to kind of decide what's going to happen next in his life. I had to look this up. This is called a side part. It was a hairstyle favored by young professionals, attorneys, that kind of thing. So he's trying to sort of identify with other young guys on the move. He'd already begun to court his distant kinswoman, Mary Channing. He met her at Cambridge. Her father taught medicine at Harvard. And they were a very odd couple. She was 3 years his senior. And of course, this is the 19th century in which usually it's the man who's at least 3 years older than the woman, and he's made his way in life and started his occupation. And he still didn't have a job. But he's courting Mary, and Higginson was just the most optimistic person on the planet. Those of us of an age might recall Hubert Humphrey, famously known as the happy warrior. That was Higginson. He just was the happiest warrior, and in part because she was never unwell. She had just crippling arthritis very early on. Mary was caustic and difficult to be around. Higginson's friends, mostly his female friends, just found her really hard to be around. So they're kind of the odd couple. She's older, and she's already 26, so she's heading into spinsterhood for those days. They get married. He doesn't have a job yet. She never liked the women he knew well, and especially really disliked Emily Dickinson. More on that in a few minutes. So they got married in 1847, and at that point he did take a job. Took a job at a Unitarian church in Newburyport. And as far as he was concerned, the reason he was there at the pulpit was to explain how people need to reform themselves in America. He once said in his diary, and he wrote in his diary every day from when he was 13 to 5 days before he died in 1911. It's just an amazing diary. He said, if a Sunday passes and I don't mention anti-slavery from the pulpit, it's a wasted Sunday. Now bear in mind, this is Newburyport in New England, and a lot of the wealthy men in this congregation are involved and invested in cotton factories in New England. And of course, the cotton is coming from the South. And this is the time in which there's a movement on to get produce that is not coming from the Caribbean or slavery, and to wear wool and not cotton, that kind of thing. So he's always lecturing his congregation. And finally, the final straw is he's supposed to give a Thanksgiving sermon. And what the congregation wants is kind of a usual Thanksgiving. We love America, we're doing so well. And he calls his Thanksgiving sermon Merchants. And he has it published as a pamphlet. It even winds up in Dublin among anti-slavery people. So he kind of really goes after the wealthy guys in his congregation, and they're the trustees, for being involved with cotton slavery, but also just kind of from a hardcore evangelical Christian point of view. Higginson's position is, you have too much money. Don't be spending your money on nice carriages. Give it to the poor. Be like Jesus. And instead, they simply fired him. So 2 years after he arrives at Newburyport, he's out, and again, he's married and doesn't have a job. Back. He does accept a position finally in Worcester. I was really giving a talk recently in Worcester, which is why there's a giant map here, because that's where his house was. It's now gone. And Worcester, it was, in central Massachusetts, was a real kind of anti-slavery bastion. So he made it really clear to them, I'm not simply here to talk about the Bible. I'm here to talk about the Bible's application in everyday life and reform and women's rights and anti-slavery. And they were pretty good with that. He also made money for himself and his family by writing pieces for The Atlantic. The Atlantic was the big magazine, stories, politics, that kind of thing in the 19th century. And by the time he died, he published 100 pieces on the nose in the Atlantic. And so he made a pretty good amount of money doing that. And also the Lyceum Circuit. The Lyceum Circuit is you travel around and speak, usually on Sundays. No one has a television or things to watch, and so you go to the local park in the middle of Auburn, and someone's getting up and speaking, and he gets paid $15 per speech, which is pretty good money for those days. So he's putting some money in his pocket. But here's where then he really starts to become famous or infamous, depending on who you act. He's what's called a physical force abolitionist, and probably most of you know that kind of basic story. So it's William Lloyd Garrison, 1831, who becomes kind of the big voice of anti-slavery, publishes the Liberator newspaper, a weekly. And Garrison is a pacifist. Garrison also does not vote because the Constitution did protect slavery in 3 different terms. They never used the word slavery until the 13th Amendment, but persons held in labor, that kind of thing. So Garrison regards the Constitution as a pact with Satan, as he calls it, and wouldn't vote. And again, was a pacifist. Garrison practiced what he called moral suasion. He simply convinced the white South that slavery is so clearly immoral and unchristian maybe 20 years max, they'd go, oh, yeah, no, we get it. We'll just kind of free our slaves on our own without any kind of input from the government. Moral suasion. The vast majority of black abolitionists in the North didn't buy into that. And of course, the person just down the road here who was the most unwilling to buy moral suasion was former slave Frederick Douglass. And easy to see why. Garrison was a nice white man from Boston, and Douglass was a runaway slave from Maryland. And Douglass would say things at speeches. And of course, he's an elegant man, always beautifully dressed. He'd say, I'm not taking my shirt off. But if I did, you'd see the scars on my back. And bear in mind, he's 17 when he runs away. So Douglass is beaten as a boy. So Douglass has no patience for moral suasion and becomes involved in what he calls physical force abolition, meaning he's willing to vote to get rid of slavery, and is also willing to use violence to end slavery. So that's a fairly common position for black guys in my Syracuse. Jermaine Loveland, who is a Tennessee runaway, who gets to Syracuse and is the founder of the big AME church in Syracuse. They're willing to use violence in a way that Garrison is not. So what makes Higginson unusual is that he's a privileged white guy who's also willing to use violence. He's a big guy. He's 6'2". In a time relatively smaller men, and really believes in physical fitness. And wherever he lands, he builds a gym. When he dies, he has barbells next to his bed. He's still doing this in his old age. The first job he gets actually right out of Harvard, he's tutoring boys. And he's tutoring them in Greek and Latin and also in boxing. And they fire him. They don't want the kids to learn how to box. And so Higginson is a guy who really believes it's important to be physically active. So part of why he is a physical force abolitionist is because he just can't sit still. And he went to the South, Virginia, he had family down there, and just did not buy the idea that moral suasion was ever going to carry a single person in the white South. So here he is, and so 1854, the first kind of really big event in Boston, and there's a Virginia slave named Anthony Burns. And Burns got out. He actually got on a ship in Richmond, pulled a tarp over his head, and then lands in Boston. And was working in Boston. And one of those very kind of strange small world things, he's walking down the street and is seen by a man who is a friend of his owner. He's like, oh, there's Anthony. So under the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, he's arrested. And at that point, federal marshals are involved. And so Higginson's out in Worcester, and he gets a telegram saying, you got to come to Boston, you got to be involved in trying to get this guy out. They have him in the Boston courthouse, and they have him upstairs chained to a bed. So Higginson arrives, and he's willing to use force. And so this image here, he buys a dozen axes and puts them all around the courthouse in Boston, hiding behind water barrels and that kind of thing. So if they have to, they can kind of chop their way through windows and doors. And he goes to Faneuil Hall, and here's the big meeting, Faneuil Hall, better now, kind of the big Boston venue. And Garrison is speaking, and there's speeches, and there's speeches, and there's speeches, and Higginson is just kind of running out of patience. And there was a former slave standing by the back door, a guy named Lewis Hayden, who's also not a moral suasion guy. And Higginson says to Hayden, you and me, man. So they go outside. There's also a handful of blacks kind of sort of wandering around the area. And they pass a building site, and there's a giant beam they're going to use for a ceiling beam. So Higginson and Hayden and 12 other guys, again, mostly black, pick it up. And they just kind of go running down the street like it's a medieval battering ram. And they smash their way through the Boston courthouse door. It just splinters it. Higginson has nothing but his fists, as he says, so he's boxing away. Lewis Hayden pulls out a gun and kills a federal marshal. Which is frowned on by the government. And so it doesn't work out. And again, they simply can't get far enough in the door. And Higginson takes a slash right here to his chin with the saber by one of the marshals. And is very proud of the slash. And so most of his life, except when he's in the Civil War, down on the Carolina coast, wears what's called cavalry whiskers. Cavalry whiskers is a mustache down into the sideburns because he wants you to see his scar. So they can't get in, and again, Burns is chained to a bed on the 3rd floor. But again, a federal marshal has now been killed. Higginson goes back to Worcester and patiently waits to be arrested. And he's one of these guys who's always willing to break the law and then accept whatever penalty the government wants to impose. And President Franklin Pierce really wants these guys punished. So they send a federal marshal out to Worcester, the unfortunately named Asa Buttman. And so Buttman's job is to go out and arrest Higginson and bring him to trial. And Higginson's like, yeah, I'm ready to go. So Buttman gets to Worcester and is set up on, it's a big anti-slavery town. It's set up on by a mob, mostly of black guys, probably runaways. And they're just beating poor Buttman. He's down on his hands and knees, kind of screaming. And who wades into the mob, parts the waters like Moses? It's Higginson. So parts the crowd, and they're still throwing rocks at Buttman, puts Buttman in his carriage and takes him to the train station, back to Boston. And while they're waiting for the train, Higginson lectures him on his many sins. And what, again, Higginson's a minister. Train pulls up, and Higginson says to Buttman, maybe you shouldn't come back to Worcester. And Buttman says, I promise, I'm not. Higginson said in his diary, I've never seen a man look so terrified in his entire life. So, Higginson's always ready to rumble. And in the late 50s, he gets involved in what's called the secession movement, or also the disunion movement. And so, again, this is Dred Scott, 1857. I remind my students, we tend to think things get better all the time. And maybe we're disabused of that idea now. But that seems to be, sorry, couldn't resist. That seems to be, kind of the idea they have. And there's Douglas on the wall behind me. I try to emphasize my students, in the 1850s, it looks to a lot of Americans like America's just going backward. First the Fugitive Slave Act, then Kansas, Nebraska, and now Dred Scott decision, which says even if you were born free in the North, like Douglas's two sons who were born in New Bedford, you are not a citizen of the US. So for Higginson, he thinks simply the time has come for the North to secede from the South. And so starts this big, it's called the Disunion series. They have a big convention in Worcester, and the idea is there'll be other conventions. So somebody has the idea of writing to William Seward, the very charismatic, very powerful senator who's been saying things like, the country is coming apart. And Higginson says, I don't really think he's kind of on board with this. But he writes anyway to Seward and gets the scathing reply. I should send you a copy. It's really pretty hilarious. In which he says, this is not the way to do it. I'm committed to the Union. And then he says, and by the way, those guys in the South, they're bluffing. They're never going to secede, no matter what happens. Turns out Higginson was right on that score, and Seward was not. But Seward just will not get on board. So in 60 comes, and Higginson had been voting Liberty Party, which is kind of the classic third party. It's like voting for Nader in 2000. Among hardcore abolitionists, the question is, what to do about Lincoln. And a lot of guys still want to vote for Gerrit Smith, the New Yorker who's kind of the long-standing Liberty Party, third party candidate. And you might remember from other talks or whatever, or other books, there's two Democrats in the race in 1860, John C. Breckinridge and Stephen Douglas, both advocate the annexation of Cuba from Spain that still had slavery. So Higginson gets up at a convention and says, well, look, I wish Garrison was running, but he's not, and Lincoln is. And like it or not, Lincoln is the first anti-slavery candidate running really since John Quincy Adams, and so we got to do the right thing and vote for this guy and not go third party because things could go haywire. And there's an abolitionist named Parker Pillsbury, and he gets up and he says, points at Higginson. He said, I love my friend Higginson. I just hate his ideas. So Lincoln does kind of hold his nose, pardon me, Higginson, and does vote for Lincoln in 60. So when the war breaks out, the question is what he will do. And a lot of abolitionists didn't want to get involved in the war because initially Lincoln and Seward are simply saying this is a war for reunion, not a war against slavery. Plus, at this point, Higginson is 38, and there are guys that age enlisting, but they're not being drafted at that age. And nobody thinks he's going to sign up, but all the young men in Worcester are. And he said in his diary, I can't just kind of watch them march off and pray with them and then leave them alone. So he does enlist, but he figures he'll be a desk captain. And again, he's pushing 39. Gets a position with the Massachusetts 51st, which is a white regiment, as a captain, and his job basically is to process paperwork. So he's doing that, and he gets a letter in the fall of 62 from a guy named Rufus Saxton. Saxton is down on the Carolina coast. They'd already captured Beaufort, the Navy had pretty early on. And Saxton is a regular Army guy, he's a West Point guy, but unlike most generals at that point, he is an abolitionist. And so there was a very, very troubled regiment of contraband runaways from the Carolina coast and northern Florida called the South Carolina 1st, which again is the first regiment to be recognized by the War Department. And Saxton writes, says, we got all kinds of trouble. Lincoln just fired the colonel, a guy named David Hunter. We really need you to come down here and sort of see what's going on and take control of this regiment because you're a very, very smart, organized guy. So Higginson does get on the boat, goes all the way down to Beaufort, and he's just not convinced. And Saxton says, just go talk to the guys, just talk to the men, just get a sense. So Higginson's kind of wandering up and down the ranks and talking to people, and one private, had been wounded in an upriver raid. The Army needed just huge amounts of iron, steel, lumber, and also liberating slaves as they go up these rivers, the St. Mary's, that kind of thing. So Higginson sees this young private who's been shot in the leg, a big bandage. Higginson says, probably more than you expected, right? More than you signed up for. And the young private said, Master, this is exactly what I signed up for. And Higginson went back and found Saxton and shook his hand and said, I'm all in, and wrote in his diary, note, tell the men not to call white officers master. Tell them to call them captain, colonel, sergeant, that kind of thing. So he's all in. So here's on the Carolina coast, and this actually is the camp. They named it Camp Saxton. It's in Beaufort, just about a mile or so away from Beaufort. So that's not a generic photo. That is his regiment down there on the coast. This is the one time he just goes full beard, so he's not wearing the cavalry whiskers with the nice little chin. And he realizes this is a very different kind of regiment to be in charge of. And about the same time he gets there, here comes Rob Shaw in the 54th, and if you know that story, the guys Rob Shaw is leading are black men born in the North. He has both Douglas boys, Lewis and Charles, in the regiment. And of course, Shaw had been in battle, he'd been in Antietam, and knew how frightening and terrifying battle was. And so it really was a pretty kind of tough colonel on his guys. Higginson just did the opposite. He said, there's nothing I can do to these men by way of punishment that hasn't already been done to them. These are guys a week or two out of slavery on the Carolina coast and Florida. When they come to the camp as runaways, they bring their wives, their children, their parents. And of course, under South Carolina law, their wives are not legally their wives. And Higginson, as a minister, just loves marrying these people. But he understands that basically, he's the white outsider. He's the Harvard guy. And these are non-literate, in many cases, children of Africans who were brought into South Carolina before the cutoff date of 1808. So he has a black corporal and a black sergeant, Robert Sutton and Prince Rivers. And he basically puts them in charge and says, I'll be the guy doing the paperwork and I will go on the raids upriver. But basically, I'm going to let the black guys run the regiment. And when they run away as entire plantations. So basically, all the guys in his regiment, they knew each other, for years in slavery. It's interesting to watch kind of how the regiment is 1,000 guys, how it pans out. If you had been a black driver, a driver is kind of a sub-overseer. If you'd been a skilled artisan, a carpenter, then you're literate. Those are the guys who become the colonels, the corporals, the sergeants, that kind of thing. So it's kind of the old plantation regime just kind of falls into place at Higginson's regiment, and he's aware of that, and he's perfectly fine with that. Here's my favorite moment of the book. So again, he gets down there in December 62, and then of course, here comes January 1, and that is the final date of the Emancipation Proclamation, first issued preliminary in September, now going to be finalized on the 1st of January. And so of course, all these guys who fled to the regiment, they're under the Army protection. But Higginson writes to Mary, his wife, and says, but what if we lose? This is after Antietam, this is before Gettysburg and Vicksburg. He said, what if we lose? He said, I can get on a boat and come home. I'll be fine. He said, but these guys have come to camp with their families. We can't get them all out. And if the U.S. loses this war against the Confederacy, these guys are going back into slavery. So they have this big ceremony on January 1, and they're going to read the Emancipation Proclamation. And Higginson notes the guys in his regiment, almost none of whom can read. They just want to have a copy of the paper in their hand. He says they can't read it, but they just want to see, and someone says that's the Emancipation Proclamation, and they want that in their hand. So they have this big ceremony, and Higginson's sitting down in the middle, and the two guys standing, that's his corporal and his sergeant, Prince Rivers and Robert Sutton. And dignitaries are there, soldiers, officers are there, white ministers are there, white teachers who are, come down to the coast. They're all there too. So they built a small stage. And standing in front are the parents, wives, children of the guys in his regiment. And one of the older men right down front, in a moment of quiet, begins to sing, "My country, 'tis of thee." And the people on the stand begin to join in and sing too. Higginson turns around and he shushes them. He goes, no. He said, leave it to them. They've never had a country, and now they're going to have one, and now they're going to fight for one. He said, leave it to them. And so the audience down front all begins to sing, "My country, 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty." Higginson said in his diary, I got up and said a few words after that. He said, but nothing powerful like that moment. It's just this kind of amazing moment in time, amazing moment in the book. In '64, he's on an upriver raid and nearly killed. They're raiding upriver on a steamer called the John Adams. They turned a bend on the St. Mary's River, if you know South Carolina geography. And Confederates are entrenched on either side of the river and are firing down with rifle, with cannon. The captain of the ship is killed. The young man standing right next to Higginson is killed. His head was literally blown off. And again, Higginson, the boxer, says he felt like the blow on the side. He fell to his knees and immediately reaches down and there's no blood, but a piece of shrapnel had gone by and missed his side by about this much and just cracked all the ribs on this side. He went back home for convalescence. And thought he was better, and he came back, and he just wasn't the same guy. He just couldn't catch his breath, and again, he's a guy who wants to be 100% or nothing. So he musters out and goes back home, but spends most of the rest of the war lobbying in Washington, D.C., lobbying for black soldiers to get equal pay to whites, which they finally get thanks to Thad Stevens, lobbying for people like Corporal Sutton, to become Captain Sutton and to become commissioned officers, which they finally were able to do at the very, very end of the war when black men could become commissioned officers. But this image tells a lot. He's gone back to his cavalry shaving. But he has this kind of not sad as much as haunted look, expression. And probably so many guys, North and South, came home after the war with this kind of expression. Like he just is just sort of haunted. And the second he's back, he gets letters from his old friends, Katie Stanton, you got to come talk at our convention. And he'd always, again, been a great conventioneer. And he writes back and he said, I just need some quiet. And for months he just goes no place. In his diary he talks about, I went out on a long walk in the woods and it was quiet, I could hear the birds. That's kind of really what he needed because of what he'd seen during the war. And this image tells us a lot about what these guys faced, again, North and South. When he's back, he mostly is involved in women's rights. He'd been involved before the war, but he's really deeply involved after the war. And here are two women who are really important to him, almost as important as his mother and the two wives. They're both named Mary. And of course, here on the left is Emily Dickinson, the poet. And Higginson wrote poetry. He wrote a novel. It wasn't very good, but he wrote a novel. And he wrote a lot of poetry. And he was aware of the fact that it wasn't great poetry, that nobody would be reading it in the year 2025. In part because he knew and was friends with real poets, Emerson, Thoreau, Whitman, who he didn't like. I can tell you why later on if you're interested. But he writes a piece in Life Monthly, this is late '61, and he says, it's called An Address to Young Poets. And he says, don't be concerned about the fact that you think I'm not as great as Thoreau. He said, just, get your stuff out there. Don't be stymied by your sort of concern about yourself. And just as getting ready to leave for South Carolina, he goes to the post office, and there is a letter addressed to him. And it has 3 poems inside, and no signature, but there's a calling card, and that's Emily Dickinson. And the one-sentence letter says, can you tell me if my prose is alive? Higginson admitted late in life, he simply didn't understand her poetry. It was just kind of way over his head, but he understood it was new, it was different, and it was brilliant. She'd send him poems, he'd send them back. Usually he would add punctuation. If you're up on Emily Dickinson, she wasn't really much involved in punctuation, so he'd put in periods and commas, that kind of thing, and change her spelling. Because again, he's a pretty kind of mainstream sort of guy. And they only met twice. But reading the correspondence through Higginson's eyes, you get a really sort of different image of her. So when he goes to South Carolina, I mean, he's famous or infamous because of Anthony Burns. And so in the South, they want to get him and arrest him, and put him on trial. Now he's leading contraband black regiment. And in the North, conservative Democratic editors think it's just intolerable that he's not in jail, but now in fact he's going to be a colonel of a regiment. So North and South, East and West, I mean, his appointment in South Carolina makes all the press. So the one person in the country who doesn't know where Higginson is Emily Dickinson. So he keeps writing him poems, and sometimes Mary sends him on down the coast to Beaufort. Mostly she doesn't. And at one point, Emily writes to him and says, well, what have I done? Are you angry with me? What have I done? And he finally writes to her and he says, hi, I'm kind of busy right now. I'm not in Worcester. I'm down here on the coast. I'm leading raids and getting shot at. She writes back and she says, okay, but who will tell me if you die? Understanding that Mary probably would not. At one point, Mary is reading these letters from Emily Dickinson, and maybe she's a bit jealous. But she wrote to her husband, she said, why do the insane cling to you so? So seeing this story kind of through Higginson's eyes. So finally, after the war, he's giving a talk in Amherst, where she lived. And if you know the story, she was basically a recluse, wouldn't kind of leave her father's house. And so writes her a note and said, hi, I'm here in town. Can I come over and say hello? They'd never met. And she writes back and says, well, if you must, I guess. So he does go over, and I would love to have a picture of this, because Emily Dickinson is about 5 foot nothing, and Higginson's 6'2", robust guy, and she comes traipsing down the stairs holding tulips and hands him the tulips. But they talk for about 6 hours and have dinner, and he really meant a lot to her, and vice versa. And so she knew she was unwell, and so she prepared her will very carefully, and of course she led a recluse life, so her plan was for a recluse funeral, very small, only invitees, that kind of thing. But she made it very clear in her will that he would be there. And not only would Higginson be there, but what poem by Emily Bronte he would read that they both sort of really admired. So we got on the train and went down when she passed and opened casket. And he said, well, she looks just like herself. And then co-authored the first 3 volumes of her poetry. And a lot of publishers didn't like her poetry and just wouldn't go near it. And finally Higginson said, because again, he's sending all these pieces to the Atlantic magazine, I'm not going to send any more pieces until you start publishing Emily's work. And so not only does he edit her first 3 volumes, or co-edit, and again, there's a debate among historians of literature how much he changes punctuation, that kind of thing, and it's probably pretty modest. But really sort of makes her famous, and of course today she's the one people read in college, and not Higginson, at least when it comes to his poetry. The other is Stone. 1 second here. Is Lucy Stone. They'd met before the war at an anti-slavery convention, and she's getting married. It's 1854, and to a guy named Henry Blackwell, a fellow abolitionist. And she does not want to take Blackwell's name. She likes Lucy Stone as a name, and she refuses to say the word obey in the wedding vow. They can't find a minister anywhere in the Boston area who will agree to leave the word obey out. And then she remembers, oh, Higginson out in Worcester. So sends him a telegram, and he's like, all in. So he's on the train, and the only concern he has, he thinks that Henry Blackwell is probably not worthy of her. And by the way, he was right. He had an affair later on. But anyway, there he is. And so he does the ceremony without, giving her the name of Blackwell, and does leave the word obey out. And then the two of them write what's called the marriage protest, explaining why she's not going to obey her husband. Published all across the North, and that makes him famous again among kind of conservative critics. After the war, they co-edit the Women's Journal, which is a kind of a glossy magazine for upper middle class women. Stories, poetry, politics, that kind of thing. They have kind of a sad parting of the ways. He endorses Grover Cleveland for the presidency, and then of course it comes out that Cleveland had a child and had never married the mother, and we now of course know it's even worse than that. And so women have kind of really turned against Cleveland. In Higginson's case, James G. Blaine, who was a Republican candidate, was openly corrupt. He was taking bribes, and everyone knew that. But for a lot of women, they simply couldn't go with with Cleveland, and he was asked to resign from the board. His name was on the masthead. And so he and Stone remained friends their entire life, but he was kind of pushed out of this movement, and I came across one letter to the editor from a woman who said, in my house, Higginson's books are like the Bible, but not anymore. So this kind of costs him a fair amount. Mary first died. And again, she had arthritis so badly she couldn't hold a pencil, she couldn't walk, and Higginson would carry her around the house. And after she passed, Higginson said in his diary, this kind of sounds cold to say even to myself, but had she not died, it would have broken both of us, because he had care in the house, but even so, he's just, literally carrying her around the house. He married a much younger woman, 21 years younger, named Mary Thatcher. He called her Minnie, so he wouldn't confuse her with the other Mary. And they collaborated on works. She was a published poet and writer. And they had 2 children together. The first child sadly died of spinal meningitis before reaching the age of 1. But here he is on his bike with daughter Margaret. And I just love this photograph. So it's a special kind of tricked out bike called a Velocipede, which apparently is really, really hard to ride. I've got a cousin who's a serious bicyclist and who says you have to do all kinds of things to make this bike work. Higginson wants a bike that will challenge him. But he has a special tricked out seat for Margaret on the back. So here he is, age 65, was a much older dad with Margaret on the back. And this photograph just made him famous. Even white Southerners who always hated the guy said, that's kind of a great image, and what sort of a good late in life dad. He lived on until 1911, still very active in everything. In the 1890s, he was opposed to the war in the Philippines and wrote about that. He was still involved. He was living back in Cambridge, involved with Harvard students, and so organized the Student Socialist Society with Clarence Darrow and Jack London, of all people. And so kind of always had, and then just suddenly his health broke. And again, he wrote in his diary until about 5 days before he passed. And then the last entrance was done by hand by Minnie, who said, passed from Earth this morning at 9:12. So, active till the very end, and then he was gone 1911. I could go on for hours and bore all of you. His life was so fascinating. And again, his diary was just so much fun to read. Because he knew everybody. And again, he loved to ride his bike. And so one of his entrants late in life, he says, I was out riding bikes today with Ms. Sullivan and her ward, Ms. Keller. He's riding bikes with Annie Sullivan and Helen Keller. One assumes that Annie is steering. It's a 2-person bike. Had dinner tonight with young Mr. Churchill. That's Winston Churchill. He'd been in the Boer War, wrote a book about it, and was touring the North selling his book, and had dinner with Higginson. Higginson said, I expect great things from this guy. Became friends with Mark Twain. They had summer houses together. And he would go over early in the morning, and Twain is still lying in bed, 11 o'clock, writing, his hair kind of all wild. And they would chat, and he just had a great time with Twain. Called him, of course, Samuel. Goes to England and has his wish list for those he wants to meet. And so he's had dinner with Charles Darwin. Turns out he's a Twain fan, so they're discussing Twain stories with Charles Darwin. Has dinner with H.G. Wells, who, of course, is a science fiction writer, but also a socialist. And so he just kind of meets everybody. And it's just so much fun to read. But I'll finish this way, and then we have time for questions, if you have some. The title, A Man on Fire, comes from an obituary. And again, I thought about calling it The Ally, but then I read this obituary that said he was always a man on fire. He was just a man, there was just nothing he didn't want to be involved in. And in 1881, he wrote in his diary, he said, I'll probably never have a biographer. He said, but just in case I do, here's the clue to my life. And he said, I never wanted to be eminent in this way or that, but to be involved in everything, lead a whole life, and take on any issue that came my way. So he really is kind of a Renaissance reformer. And I think in many ways that's why he's kind of forgotten today by comparison to William Lloyd Garrison, who simply focuses on anti-slavery. His friend Susan B. Anthony focuses, of course, on women's rights. He focuses on basically everything. And in a time in which so many Americans are apathetic, I have a lot of students who aren't registered to vote, let alone vote. I yell at them for that. easy to see why people are demoralized by the state of the world. I mean, not just the U.S., but the world, and the war here, the war there. And Higginson's long life was a reminder that one needs to stay optimistic and one needs to stay active and not to give in. As a writer, historian, I'm personally inspired. He wrote a book called Army Life in a Black Regiment about his time in South Carolina. It's still in print in both paperback and hardback 155 years later. And that's something I think for any writer to take great solace in. Okay, that was 45 minutes on the nose, so I assume that leaves us questions for, and again, if you're on my left side, you have to kind of wave. Yes?
Why didn't you like Whitman?
There's the reason he gave and then the reason I suspect. Now, apart from being, again, he's a women's rights guy, but he's also a manly guy. I mean, he's a manly man. And again, he's got his gymnasium going. He, by the way, also advocated physical fitness for women as well, so it's not just the guy thing. But again, he boxes, he does all this kind of stuff. And again, he and his guys are being shot at in South Carolina, and so Whitman took a job as a male nurse during the Civil War, and he's doing some ghastly stuff. I mean, he writes about cutting off arms and pounding like cordwood. So I mean, Whitman's he's down in the mix. But for Higginson, that's not what real guys do, and so that's kind of the formal reason why he explains. He never says he doesn't like Whitman's poetry; he just doesn't like Whitman. And at one point, Whitman is giving a talk in New York, and Higginson goes and sits in the front row like this, and just kind of glares at him the whole time. The reason I didn't get into really in the book, when he's at Harvard, and again, he's 13, he's 14 at Harvard. He has an older friend, slightly older friend from South Carolina, named William Henry Herbert, who's wealthy, good-looking, charismatic, and Higginson has this just kind of real love for Herbert. And the letters they write one another are very romantic sort of letters. Now again, this is also the romantic period, and when Mary too, Minnie, writes about his life, she says, I don't really know what was going on here with this relationship. But of course, she's 20 years younger, so she's missed the whole kind of period in the 1830s when men and women are writing to each other, especially those of the upper class. And these very sort of personal, emotive, I love you kind of letters. That said, there's pretty good evidence that Herbert is what we would now call bisexual. And he becomes a very famous editor in New York City, and is engaged, and the woman apparently decides that he loves his friends more than he loves her, that kind of thing. So, was it simply kind of teen infatuation? Was there something there? Higginson actually tore a few pages out of his diary after a long weekend with Herbert. So I've got, again, that's just kind of not my area of expertise. I've got a young historian friend, Tom Borsowski, who does write about male gender sexuality in the antebellum period. And he gave me a lot of things to read. I finally kind of decided that probably, Higginson simply was very young, very, emotional, that kind of thing. So whether there was something physical going on there, I don't know. When my youngest daughter was reading the book after it came out, she calls and goes, "Dad, I didn't realize that Higginson was bi." And I said, "Well, honey, I just don't know the answer to that." But of course, Whitman was basically out. So part of me thinks that, and this is the part I'm just not qualified to write about. Was that a part of Higginson's young life he tried to kind of compartmentalize and put behind him, and then just kind of not ever go there even in his own mind? So easy to see why, again, a guy who comes back from the war looking this haunted would think that a guy who spent the war, not in battle, was not a very manly guy. But again, if you read Whitman's, what he's seeing in these battlefield hospitals, I mean, it's brutal stuff. So, I don't know. But he never actually says, I don't like his poetry. It's just, I don't like him. So, yeah, I don't. And again, Tom Borsowski was sending me these things to read. He wrote a really great book about Buchanan and Buchanan's friendship with his male partner, or whatever he was. Tom convinced me that kind of modern terms understandings we have, gay, bi, they don't really work in the 19th century for a lot of reasons. That's kind of a sort of a modern imposition on earlier ideas. So, I kind of hint at this a little bit. I simply say you will never know what to make of this or why there's pages torn out of the diary, which are otherwise never torn out of his diary. And he clearly thinks, that Hurlburt is just the most elegant, brilliant, beautiful man. There we go. Don't know. Yes, sir.
Could you refresh my memory about
But you have to use your big voice.
Oh, sorry. Could you refresh my memory about the part where he's marrying someone and they don't take the traditional vow?
Right. So that's go back. Here she is, Lucy Stone, and she's deeply involved both in anti-slavery, which is how she knows Higginson, but also the women's rights movement. And she actually had a fair amount of money, and the guy she was getting married didn't have as much. And so she basically makes him sign what we today will call a prenup, in which they'll have their separate incomes. And she's just not, she's also a Quaker background, and so she's simply not going to say the word obey, and likes her name the way it is, although newspapers continue to call her Lucy Stone Blackwell, because the white guys who run the newspapers just aren't going to get on this bandwagon. It also leads to a very bizarre moment. Lucy Stone on one side, Higginson on her side, and Susan B. Anthony have an issue, it's a long story, at a convention after the war. And Anthony gets up and says, well, they're not really married legally because she wouldn't use the word obey. Higginson jumps up and says, I was the minister there. That's also a very strange argument for Susan B. Anthony to take, is that it's not legally binding because she wouldn't take her husband's name. But I'm looking at people who are, my age and roughly, when my older sister got married in 81, Presbyterian, she told the minister, don't say obey. And guess what the minister said during the ceremony? And so at that point, what do you do? So that's not that long ago.
Sorry, what was Higginson Anglican or like what?
Unitarian.
Unitarian.
Yeah. Although very capacious. When he was on the school board after the war, they still use the Bible in state schools in Massachusetts to learn how to read. And Irish Catholic kids are using the King James Version. And their moms and dads want to read, the Catholic version. Higginson's position as a school board member is they're still allowed to read anything they want. And so he is a Unitarian, but very, very open to other ideas. At one point, he basically says, we're all on the same path to the same ending, and which a lot of folks then or now would not agree with. So yeah, he's yeah.
You got one over there, Doug.
Oh, yes. And you're gonna have to yell. I'm sorry.
What do you think about the transcendentalists?
Oh, he's part of that movement too, and he also has a spiritualist moment. He goes to a seance, and hears and sees a violin moving across the floor, seemingly of its own, whatever. I'm sure it's on a wire. But his position, like a lot of people who are both transcendentalists, and there's a big kind of overlap between transcendentalists and spiritualists at this point. These people devoutly believe that when they die, there'll be a heaven, and they'll open their eyes, and there'll be all their friends and mom and dad, that kind of thing. And so, assuming that's true, then why can't you have people who really are kind of conduits, who can open windows to that sort of world? And so there's a spiritualist newspaper he writes pieces for, until he finally writes a piece that touches upon anti-slavery, and the editor says, can you just focus on spiritualism? Don't mention slavery. Higginson says, sorry, that's my number one issue, and so he kind of cuts them off. But he regards himself as a transcendentalist. So technically Unitarian, but again, he's very, very, very open-minded, and the church in Worcester is called the Free Church. So it really is. It doesn't even have the word Unitarian attached. Yes, sir.
What was Higginson's relationship with the black community after the war? A lot of abolitionists really backed away.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering where Higginson.
I'm sorry you asked me that because. No, and mostly I just loved writing about the guy, but no, that's one of the two issues. He backs away, and he's not alone. I mean, you're right. I mean, when the 13th Amendment is ratified, Garrison prints the last issue In December of 65, they're liberated with his own hands, and then he's done. Higginson just doesn't focus much on that, and he's actually invited on the anniversary of a big battle, Revolutionary era battle in South Carolina, to come down and give the kind of the New England, because New Englanders are there during the Revolution fighting this battle, so he's invited down to speak. And it's clear things are going badly. And one of his two, Prince Rivers, the officers during the war, had become a judge, and they burned his house. White mob. So Egerton knows things are going sideways in the South. And so in the speech, he basically criticizes the North, and he says, well, it's easy to criticize you guys down here, but we have segregated schools in Boston, we have segregated carriages in New York City, all of which is true, but that says nothing about what's happening in the South, which is this massive rise of lynchings and violence. And for a guy who's just kind of always discussing politics in his diary, he doesn't mention Plessy. So that's not, he doesn't become kind of an old, sort of Old South defender. But he really kind of pulls his punches in that speech, and he always had huge support in the black press. And in that speech, the black press, they're not amused. And they kind of really sort of come out against him and talk about how disappointed they are in him. And yeah, me too. So yeah, not his best moment, and especially because he knew guys down there who were now facing brutality. I'll just give you one bit of data. I mean, I wrote about this in my book on Reconstruction. What's his name? The South Carolina black pilot steals the planter ship.
Smalls.
Robert Smalls, thank you. That's why you always have former students in the background. So Robert Smalls is elected to Congress, and then in 1893, South Carolina is revising their state constitution, and they're going, Jim Crow. And Smalls gets up and he says, since the war ended, 53,000 black men have been targeted for removal and assassination in the South. And I always thought, he didn't say like about 50 or above 50, he said 53,000. Smalls is keeping data. So for Higginson to just kind of ignore that, both in his diary, in his speeches in the North, and then when he gives this big speech in the South, that's a puzzle. And again, everything he says, being critical of the North, is true. But that doesn't absolve, there's just a huge rising death toll in the South. So, yeah, sorry. It's not his best moment as far as I'm concerned. Yes, sir.
One of two, what was the second?
I just answered this in a different question. I'll tell you. I need more coffee today. Richard will come to me. I'm sorry. Right in the middle of my next sentence, I'll go, oh yeah, that's it. I was just giving a talk on Gilder Lehrman, and I had two.
Watch that clip online.
You got any coffee? So
Yeah.
it'll pop into my head in a second.
Maybe one more question for
Sure.
Doug. There was one over here earlier. No.
Yeah.
Yes, yes, sir.
He was involved with Secret Six.
Yes.
John Brown.
Yeah, that's another part. Again, this is why I could give hours on this. He's first out there in Kansas running guns. So New Englanders during Kansas-Nebraska, Bleeding Kansas, are raising money. And so he's kind of involved in collecting the money and then getting money from Garrett Smith. They're going to buy guns, take out to Kansas. And he finally realizes, I've got to go there myself and see what's going on and bring them the guns myself. And so he's out there, and that's when he first meets Brown. And of course, Brown always used pseudonyms. So the first time he meets Brown, he's going by like John Smith or something like that. And one more hilarious story, and I'll get back to the Secret Six. So if you know much about Kansas, Nebraska, and Bleeding Kansas, there are some towns that are free soil towns, some towns that are slave soil towns, and people are coming just to these towns. Topeka's free, Lecompton is slave. Higginson wants to see what's going on in Lecompton. So he gets on his horse and he rides into Lecompton. And he's talking to these two guys from Missouri who just moved there. And they said, well, we hear there's a minister here from New England. And he's out here, talking about the Negroes. And of course, doesn't use the word Negroes. But we're going to get it. We're going to kill him. And of course, what he's looking for is kind of the quintessential New England minister, 5'6", carrying a Bible. Higginson at this point is bronzed. He's got a Sharps rifle. He has a Bowie knife stuck in his boot. And again, he's 6'2". And Higginson says to the guys, I'll keep my eyes peeled. If I see anybody who looks like that, I'll let you know. So he does come back and gets involved with Brown's operation, although he said, long after the fact, he said, that the only plan he knew was that Brown was going to hit and run plantations and take runaways up into the hills of Western Virginia and start sort of a maroon colony, and then use those guys to get back and liberate more people. So he's actually involved in raising money for Brown, but claimed the first time he heard the words Harper's Ferry was when he read about it in the newspaper. He does then go to Brown's farm up in the Adirondacks, and he's going to take Brown's wife down to the court in Western Virginia. And she's hoping to convince her husband to plead innocent or to plead insanity, that kind of thing. And it tells you a lot. Higginson's willing to literally take her into Western Virginia, where he's wanted because he's one of the Secret Six. They get as far as Baltimore, and he gets a telegram from Brown who says, don't bring her. He said, if I see her, I'll lose all. I will, in fact, beg for mercy, and I don't want to do that. So just don't bring her down here. And then Higginson goes on to raise money for the family, which are destitute up there in Lake Placid area. So, yeah, he's involved in that. And same thing, waits to be arrested, and you probably know everybody else runs for cover. I mean, Douglas wisely, gets into Canada, then gets a boat for England, because they really want Douglas in the South. Garrett Smith checks himself into an asylum with a nervous breakdown. Higginson just waits to be arrested and writes to Garrett Smith and says, "Is there no honor among Confederates? This is not the time to pretend we weren't involved in this." And part they don't arrest him because he's the one guy willing to be arrested. He's convinced, and probably so.